All right. Hey, everybody. Do we want to? Oh, there we go. All right. Beautiful. Hi. Welcome. My name is Frank Lantz. I'm the director of the NYU Game Center, and this is Counting Frames.
An overhand right sends Bunny to the canvas. Referee Jersey Joe Walcott trying to get Ali to a neutral corner. Ali yelling at Liston to get up and fight.
The anchor punch.
Which punch?
Anchor. I call it the anchor punch.
Can someone step and fetch it out there?
Yeah, man. And people couldn't see it. It was so fast. Sport Illustrated clocked they got a slow motion camera. They clocked the punch, and the punch flew at 4/100ths of a second. You can break a second down to 100 pieces. You know how people win a ski race, they say he won in 16/100ths, he won in 32/100ths of a second. So you can break a second down to 100 pieces. So, you know, yeah, it's quick. So 4/100, they got a machine that goes like, real quick, and it counts real quick, you know, real quick. And by the time that thing hit 4, that's how quick, from the time the punch started to the where it landed, it was 4/100ths of a second, which is an eye blink. Like a camera flash, that's 400ths of a second. Now, the minute I hit Sonny Liston, all of those people blinked at that moment. That's why they didn't see the ball. I swear. Now, if you watch the film close, you gotta hold your eyes and keep looking about that. When I said, all right, I'm getting ready to hit him, you can't just, you got to hold your eyes and wait, or you won't see it, man.
That's from that great documentary, The Rumble in the Jungle, called When We Were Kings, which is a great movie you should see if you haven't seen it. So this is what I do. This is the NYU Game Center. I'm the director of this place. We've been around for quite a few years. We're basically the game design department of NYU. We've got an MFA program, which is a 2-year graduate program, an undergrad program that's going to start next year. We're in the Tisch School of the Arts. And our big idea is basically that we're a game program that's not attached to any other kind of program. We just study games for their own sake, in the same way that an art school or a film school studies these forms of culture. We study games as a form of culture, game design as creative practice, games as an aesthetic form, something like film or literature. And we have very much an art school or film school approach, which is that we're teaching the craft and the skill of making games, but also getting people to explore their own personal vision for the kind of games they want to make, and doing all of that within a kind of context of advanced critical literacy. So in the studio approach, you learn by doing. You're constantly making games. We have a series of studio classes in which students by themselves or in small groups are building games, designing games, creating games, and mastering the craft that goes into that, but at the same time discovering their unique creative vision and exploring that. So this is some examples of some of the work that's being done in our program. Some of these games are set up out in the display area. You can check out some of the games that are being done by our students. And you know, one of the things that we do is we host a bunch of competitive game tournaments, including fighting game tournaments. We're really interested in competitive games and esports and sort of high-level competition. So we have, for example, Spring Fighter, which is very is kind of growing. This is I think we've had 4 years of Spring Fighter so far. Keeps getting bigger and bigger and better. Organized by a colleague of mine, Charles Pratt, and it's just an amazing tournament that we hold in New York City, where we are. We try to think of these things as more than just tournaments, but also as opportunities to kind of provide context around these games, to think about how to understand them at a deeper level, how to think about them as culture, and how to kind of gain a kind of critical insight into these kinds of games. So we host panels, and we've had guests like Seth Killian and Daigo, and you know, discussions and analysis and stuff like that. And of course, we are working with EVO to run this thing called the NYU Game Center EVO Scholarship. So this is something that we did last year for the first time. It was a big success. The idea of the EVO Scholarship is that it is funded by the money from the EVO pay-per-views stream, and all of that money goes towards supporting somebody from the fighting game community who has some talent, some interest in game design, and would like to get a degree in game design and couldn't afford to go otherwise. So the scholarship is there to support someone, to give them a chance to get a degree in game design and pursue that as a career. And this is something that was really created by Tom Cannon, one of the founders of EVO, the guy who runs the whole thing. And his vision is to contribute to the fighting game community. I mean, he wants to support it in various ways, and he's especially interested in ways that the pursuit of excellence in fighting games can be part of a successful life, regardless of whether you become a pro gamer, regardless of whether you go on to like win tournaments and make money that way or get sponsorship. But all of the other ways that fighting games can improve your life and be part of a successful life. So I think that's one of the things that Tom is really passionate about, and we're really excited to be part of that vision and work with him on that. So at the Game Center, in addition to creating an environment that helps talented people develop skills, realize their vision, we see one of our responsibilities as increasing understanding of what games are, of what's interesting and beautiful and meaningful about games, and supporting those things and helping them evolve and grow. So we happen to think that fighting games are one of the most interesting and valuable and important domains of games that's happening right now. And I don't think I need to, I'm preaching to the choir. Obviously, everyone who's here at EVO understands and appreciates the beauty of fighting games. But I wanted to come and share with you some of my thoughts about what makes fighting games so cool from our perspective, how we think about them within a university context, within a context of kind of advanced critical literacy and design research. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, there's there's kind of a dilemma in this, a little bit, in talking about something that's hard to put in words. And I think the beauty and meaning of fighting games is a classic example of something that's hard to describe in words. It's true of games in general. So, it's not my intention to drain the life and the magic out of this strange and beautiful thing by choking it with words, but to really deepen our appreciation and understanding of it in a way that hopefully will leave it even more mysterious and beautiful than when we started. So that's my little anti-academic, argument there. I want to start with a little story. A few years ago, there was a president of a Japanese electronics firm who decided to sell off the firm's collection of 20th century French paintings, abstract paintings and impressionist paintings. And one of them was this Picasso, for example. It's worth about $20 million, this collection. And the president received presentations from the two major auction houses to decide who's going to handle this sale, Christie's and Sotheby's. And he saw them. He really felt that the two presentations were equal and both convincing. So he proposed to make the decision based on a game of rock, paper, scissors between the two firms. So Sotheby's said, yeah, okay, that's fine, we'll do that. Both of the firms said, okay, that makes sense, we'll do that. But Sotheby's was kind of just blew it off a little bit. They said, it's basically random. We understand how rock, paper, scissors work. It's basically random, there's no point. Christie's, on the other hand, took it a little more seriously and started to do some research. They started poking around on the internet, and they discovered that there was a certain amount of kind of high-level rock, paper, scissors strategy and theory crafting. And in fact, one of the people who worked at Christie's had two 11-year-old daughters, two twin daughters, who on the schoolyard played a lot of rock, paper, scissors. And they said, obviously, their names were Alice and Flora. They said, everybody knows that you start with scissors because rock is way too obvious. And so, since this is a beginner's game, this is a match between two beginners, the safest choice is scissors. And if there's a tie, then you do scissors again because everybody expects you to do rock, right, at that point. So the big day came, the representatives of the firm were sitting around the big table, and they decided to write down their choices to avoid any ambiguity. The president of the firm opened up the envelopes. Sotheby's had selected paper. Christie's had selected scissors. And they won. They won this contract which was worth millions of dollars to their firm. And one of the things that I love about this story and this idea is that often things are less simple than they look, right? Rock, paper, scissors looks pretty simple, but if you peer under the hood, there's more going on there, right? There's more subtlety, there's more depth, there's more interesting stuff happening there. And I think that that's true about the world in general, and I think games are a way into that truth, and I think fighting games do that in a particularly effective way, right? A way in which the world, fighting games are a great way to make the kind of world open up under your attention to reveal hidden depths. I had a personal epiphany with fighting games that happened years ago, many, many years ago, and people in my office were sitting around playing Mortal Kombat, and it never occurred to me that this game was interesting because it just looked like a game of, just kind of button mashing, and then I realized over time that what was happening was, in fact, a kind of real-time chess, right? That Mortal Kombat was not just a series of actions, but it was a series of kind of simultaneous choices, and it was something that you could study like chess and get good at through study, that it was a kind of cognitive activity. It didn't look cerebral, right? It didn't look mental, it didn't look cognitive, but in fact, under the hood it was. And that was kind of mind-blowing for me, and that really stuck with me as a way of looking at games in general. And sometimes things are less simple than they look. We have a class at the Game Center called Games 101, one of our anchor classes. It's kind of almost like an art history survey of the whole history of games, in which we kind of go through and we look at games through different lenses, through different frames, if you will, of play, design, and history. So play meaning the kind of moment-to-moment experience of what it's like to actually play the game. What is the game as lived experience? Design, how does the game work? Like, what are the formal and material qualities that lead to that experience? And then history, how does the game fit into the world? Who's it for? Who plays it? What came before it? What came after it? How does it connect to the world in all the complicated ways that culture connects to the world? So I'm going to, this is not, we actually, in Games 101, we talk about fighting games as a whole fighting games lecture, but I'm not going to try to do that here because it's way too rudimentary for you guys are way advanced beyond the Games 101 level of what we talk about, because it's meant to kind of introduce a lot of these important topics to people who don't necessarily have ever played a fighting game. But instead I'm going to kind of try to use these three lenses to give you a little bit of my thinking about what makes fighting games cool and worth studying and really interesting. We're going to start with history. So part of our approach at the Game Center is to understand video games within the larger context of games and play. A lot of people see video games as a kind of unique thing that just got invented recently and is interesting in a way that's totally separate from other forms of games. We see games as an ancient form of culture that's always been an important part of human life, and video games as the kind of latest and greatest and biggest and best version of this form of culture that's always been around. And fighting games are really awesome at kind of displaying that connection to earlier games, specifically to competitive games and combat sports. They so obviously draw from a tradition of games and create something new from that tradition. They are systems, they are a stylized form of social interaction, a way of humans engaging with each other to create something beautiful through a kind of stylized conflict. And they are rituals of play. And they're not, the things that sometimes get studied in video games, especially within an academic context. There's often a focus on narrative, on story, on virtual worlds, on those aspects of games. And while fighting games sometimes have that, it's not the central feature of fighting games, right? They're not known for being imaginary worlds to explore and characters to interact with and narratives or procedural narratives. They are games in a kind of very ancient and traditional sense. And they are sports. One of the biggest and most interesting things that's happening in games right now is the emergence of high-level competitive video game play, people, large-scale, incredibly exciting, dramatic spectator sports, esports. These forces in games are really interesting to us, and fighting games are definitely a part of that. The rituals and the customs of sport, you see it here at EVO. The scale and the ambition of what games can do, the kinds of communities that they create and the kinds of experiences they can create. I love this personally because of the sort of, when you think about, I mean, I'm a very ambitious person, and I want games to be as, to kind of fulfill their promise in the largest sense that they can. And when I think about the ambition of a lot of game designers, it's often constrained to wanting to do something that has the impact of like a great movie, right? Like Citizen Kane, which is the kind of running joke about when will we have a masterpiece of a video game that's like Citizen Kane, that has that kind of respect, has that kind of impact on culture. But if you think about basketball, right? Like basketball is also a designed thing, right? James Naismith created basketball in the 20th century, and look at the impact that basketball has had on the world, right? It dwarfs Citizen Kane in a way, and it's in a different way. It's equally beautiful, it's equally meaningful, it's equally important, but it's so much bigger. I mean, people architect cities around basketball. So that's one of the things that's exciting about this connection to sports, and in particular, fighting games have this deep connection to martial arts. I want to take just a couple of minutes and quietly watch this which is of a form of Okinawa-style karate called Ryu. This guy, Mas Oyama, was the creator of a school of karate that was heavily influenced, steeped and grounded in Okinawa-style karate called Kyokushin. And he was born in 1923. He was actually half Japanese, half Korean, born in Manchuria, which is a Japanese-controlled part of China. And he flew for the Japanese in World War II, and then he started studying martial arts. He experienced a certain amount of prejudice because he was half Korean, and so he split off on his own, and he started to develop his own school, and he developed this. He went up to the top of a mountain, he studied, and he developed a discipline that was grounded in a kind of super intense physical training and changing his body by he would punch trees. He would punch trees, he would punch rocks, he would meditate under ice-cold waterfalls, and through this process, developed the ability to do things that seemed almost magical. He became very successful. He developed Kyokushin and then went around kind of displaying it, demonstrating this form of karate. And when he couldn't find anyone to fight him, he would do these displays where he would fight bulls. And what marks Kyokushin is that the value that it places on endurance and toughness. Advanced practitioners still kind of train in the snow. They break rocks with their hands. And he was a teacher who went on to teach a number of influential people, including this guy, Sonny Chiba. And one of the reasons this is important, Sonny became one of the first kind of pop culture phenomena of a karate star, and was the star of this movie, The Street Fighter. Now the Street Fighter, may or may not have been the inspiration for the Street Fighter, the game. Its actual title was Clash Killer Fist. But Sonny Chiba himself really is indicative of this iconic image of the lone martial artist, the karate warrior living in the modern world, who's impossibly tough and can withstand any level of pain. And he really became the sort of blueprint for this figure, for the recognizable character in Street Fighter, for Ryu, and very much inspired by the legend of Masayama. It's Ryu's depicted like the founder of Kyokushin as traveling in search of new challenges. He fights not just to win, but to learn and become stronger. And there's this important idea in martial arts of being not just a sport, but also a spiritual discipline, a way of pursuing and developing and then performing values, qualities, positive characteristics, human virtues. So the idea of warrior culture is something that maybe makes us a little uncomfortable, right? Because we don't like war. We don't like violence. We're working hard to kind of eliminate these things from the world, and yet there is still a sense in which there is this romantic ideal of the warrior, brave, self-reliant, chivalrous, honorable, that is explored and expressed in this stylized way through martial arts, and I think also in fighting games and in the fighting game community. Now, this is not limited to just combat sports. This is actually an idea that is deeply embedded in all of sports. So, for example, in classical Greece, they had this idea of arete. Arete is the concept of virtue, excellence, courage, and sport in ancient Greece was a religious ritual in which you would display these positive qualities of character. In Imperial China, they treated Go as a martial art. Go was considered a martial art, and it was considered, along with music and painting and calligraphy, to be one of the civilized arts of the cultivated civilized gentleman. So this is something you would learn as part of a good life in being civilized. But martial arts and combat games are not necessarily always in sync with the interests of civilization and the ruling class and the status quo. So if you look back at the origin of Okinawa style karate, it's actually the history here is that the island of Okinawa had an influx of Chinese immigrants in the 14th century. They brought with them Kenpo, which is the traditional martial art. And at the time, Okinawa was ruled by the Shimatsu clan from mainland Japan, and they conquered and controlled Okinawa. And the Shimatsu had a policy of no weapons. The peasants on Okinawa were not allowed to have weapons. That forced them to develop a new style of empty-hand self-defense, which was karate. So karate has built into it a kind of rebellious, subversive, revolutionary energy in its very DNA, and not just karate, but I think warrior culture in general has this oppositional quality. These two guys are super cool philosophers from the 20th century, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, important French continental postmodern 20th century philosophers, and they had this whole theory that there was something inherently rebellious and subversive and revolutionary about warrior culture. They believe that it always had a destabilizing effect on existing power structures and on the political status quo. This is a chapter from their book, Mille Plateaux, and in which they talk about this idea, the concept of the exteriority of the war machine. And in this basic theory, the state, right, the status quo, civilization, right, the political power structure is governed by two figures, the magician king and the jurist priest. So the magician king is violent, powerful, charismatic. He operates by capture, bonds, nets, and knots, and uses signs and symbols. And the jurist priest is rational, wise, institutional. He proceeds by treaties and pacts and contracts using tools and mechanisms. And so these two forces are opposed to each other, but they also work in concert to create a dynamic equilibrium that maintains stability in the power structure of the state, in society, in civilization, in the status quo. Now, the warrior, however, is always external to this equilibrium. He is a nomad outside the apparatus of the state's power structure. So sometimes the king or the priest will need to bring the warrior in to execute on some problem that they have, but when they do so, it's always dangerous for them because he doesn't belong to them. There's always something of the outsider. He's uncivilized because he does not submit to the logic that defines civilization within the boundaries of the city. He remains nomadic, a wanderer. And Deleuze and Guattari use games to express this idea. They talk a lot about Go and how Go reflects certain aspects of this nomadic force that's always destabilizing existing power structures. And I think there's an interesting angle here for looking at the fighting game community, right? At its contentious relationship to mainstream games and at the difficulty that fighting games have had in being assimilated into esports, right? I mean, there is a sense in which there's this kind of anxiety about like how some of the other types of games, right, the ones with guns and the ones with tanks have been, you know, kind of elevated by esports, while fighting games always remain kind of a little bit on the outside. And I think maybe that there's something inherently destabilizing and subversive about fighting games that makes them hard to domesticate, right? Hard to make them fit comfortably within the institutional apparatus of leagues and promotion and sponsorships and things of that nature. And I think it's appropriate that we are in Las Vegas right now because this subversive quality of people who like to fight for fun has always had the very strong association with gambling, right? They are both a part of outsider culture, underground culture, right? Fighting and gambling are for people who like to embrace risk. And they embrace risk because they're not currently in a position to benefit from the status quo, right? And they like to seek out risk as, you know, as a way of sort of sharpening the edge of life and seeking out new opportunities. These are fighting, gambling, these are activities that exist on the margins of polite society. So wealthy princes might be drawn into this world. They might want to sample its power and its energy, but it's a realm that they don't belong to, and it doesn't belong to them. But just because this realm is not a part of polite society, it doesn't mean that it is antisocial. It's still incredibly social, and it's still a realm where part of what's going on is the development and the demonstration of positive virtues, right? Part of what draws us to these activities is not just their illicit pleasure, but that the way they provide a framework for performing and demonstrating qualities of character. So there's this guy, Irving Goffman, a sociologist who has an amazing book called Interaction Ritual, and he's got a chapter called Where the Action Is, where he talks about gambling games, but I think it also, it kind of lends itself to thinking about fighting games and combat sports in general. And he talks about dangerous play as an opportunity to express positive qualities of character like these five. So starting with courage, the ability to see danger and proceed anyway, determination, which he calls gameness, which is the ability to keep going in the face of setbacks, in the face of pain and fatigue, a kind of inner will, integrity, right? the way that we can resist the temptation to take easy profit when it's given to us, if it means deviating from moral standards, or cheating, right? The sense that word is bond, right? That is integrity. Gallantry, right? Maintaining courtesy in difficult circumstances. Think of Errol Flynn in the middle of a sword fight, bending over to pick up a sword and hand it to his opponent in order to be able to finish the fight, right? This is a way of maintaining ceremonial order, but it's also a way not just of giving respect, but demanding it for oneself. And finally, composure, self-control, self-possession, poise, right? The ability to execute difficult physical tasks under pressure and not choke, right? Heart, self-confidence, presence, stage presence, right? The ability to perform up there on the main stage when the lights are on, when the chips are down, when it matters, and not to choke, right? That's composure. And again, I think this is a great angle for thinking about fighting games, and also about the fighting game community, right? That this is one of the reasons it has this kind of sacred quality. It's not just a place where people happen to like this kind of game, right? It's not that we share an interest in the same game, that we're all fans of the same kind of game, right? There's a sense of a shared project, of shared values. And it means you belong to this kind of nomadic warrior tribe, right? This church of outsiders, the church of punching and being punched. And I think that it's important to keep this in mind when we are talking about the responsibilities of the fighting game community, to be accepting, to be tolerant, to be respectful. This is not for me to decide. I'm not really part of the fighting game community, right? But this is for you to decide, what are your values? How do you want to explore them? How do you want to develop them? How do you want to display them? I think that's an important question for fighting games and the FGC in general. So moving from history to design, let's take a little look at what's interesting about the formal properties of fighting games as games, right? What are the features that makes them capable of absorbing so much of our time and attention, of generating so much passion and drama and beauty? I'm going to start with this guy, Sid Meier, the guy who designed Civilization. He has this famous quote, "A game is a series of interesting choices," which I get, yeah, okay, I see the value of that quote, but it's always bothered me. Because what about basketball? Is basketball not a game, right? What about pool or darts or tiddlywinks? These things have choices, but they also have a lot of other things. And I really feel like this is a much better version of this quote, right? A game is a series of interesting choices and actions. And in fact, I think there's a kind of a misplaced snobbishness about games that feature choices, discrete, articulated choices that you can see and contemplate and carefully consider while you're puffing your pipe and you're stroking your chin. I think there's a kind of a Sun Tzu fetishism of the strategic choice, where you come up with some move that's super original and clever and surprising and cool. And yes, I get it. I understand why that's valuable. I understand why people like that from games. You know, remember how excited I was when I looked at Mortal Kombat and said, "Oh, under the hood, it's really like chess." That's an example of this. But I think how often this form of this kind of fetishism of the idealized thought is put in opposition to action, where people, you know, when the outcome is determined by, people complain about, oh, it's just about who can click faster, right? As if the precise barrage of split-second hyperspeed execution that goes into micromanaging a complex battle isn't also a form of thought, and one that is equally fascinating and valuable. And I think fighting games show us how hard it is to separate thought and action, how complicated and blurred together these categories are, that the fractal border between our mind and our muscles, between thought and action, is very dense and very complex. Anyone? Okay, I see a couple. Yes, thank you. Set, I think, is a beautiful game, a great example of a game in which there's almost no choices. Set is not really a game of making choices. Set is a game of pure action, but it's also purely mental, right? It's like a game of perception and knowledge and understanding that happens in a split second, and yet it's also completely cognitive and completely cerebral. Here's another example of this strange blurred border. This is Terrence Chan, a poker player who's also, he's a very mathematical poker player who writes about the math of poker. And he's also an MMA fighter. He's a competitive MMA guy, and he has this awesome tattoo of the sort of normal distribution, which is a thing that kind of like binds together all the things he's interested in life. He competes in MMA using concepts from poker, using concepts about probability and simultaneous choice. And so this kind of, represents kind of Bayesian logic and how that ties these things together. Here's an example, chess boxing, which is a real sport. You box, and then you box one round, and then you play 10 minutes of chess, and you lose if you're knocked out or if you're checkmated. Here's René Descartes, who in the 17th century articulated the mind-body problem, which became this kind of central problem of philosophy. Out here is the world, it's physical. Inside is the mind. We are this purely mental stuff, this spirit, pure cogitation. How can these things ever connect? How does the world, connect to them? How can the mind ever touch the world and change it and affect it? It's impossible. It's impossible, and yet it happens all the time. So, suffice to say that I think, from a game design perspective, action, skill, execution are an example of a thing that is more complicated than it looks, right? More interesting than it might appear. And fighting games have depth, but not just in the limited kind of mathematical depth of their formal systems. Fighting games are like little symphonies of cognitive activity that play out across the full range of our mental machinery, from conscious, deliberate thought to automatic reaction and everything in between. And they make us aware of this range, because you have to be aware of it to play them well. So take a combo that you know and that you can instantly execute without even thinking about it. How did that combo get into your brain? You put it there. You hacked the wiring of your brain to put that little subroutine there, and now you can access it effortlessly. And moreover, when you play a strategic game with lots of time pressure, you have to manage your attention. What are you paying attention to? What things do you let roll on autopilot, and which things are you consciously tracking in order to rationally evaluate them? This is some very serious Daniel Kahneman style System 1, System 2 stuff, right? This is a guy who won the Nobel Prize. Not only is, and he was thinking about the difference between these modes of thought. Fighting games put that into practice. Not only is playing a fighting game a complex cognitive task, it's a complex metacognitive task. And this just isn't true about civilization, where you can take half an hour to decide whether to train an archer or train a knight. Or in reality, it actually is true of civilization, because all games have time pressure. There is actually no such thing as no time pressure. This is just kind of an abstract ideal. At the same time, that fighting games embrace action and make us question this idea of just choice and decision, they are incredibly interesting just seen through the lens of choice and decision, seen as mathematical formal systems. All competitive games get a lot of depth because, unlike the problem solving you do when you solve a puzzle or you master a single player game, the problem that you're solving in a competitive game is how to generate the hardest problem for your opponent. Pat Miller has written about this in his book, From Master to Master, which is awesome, this electronic ebook that you should get. And he calls it game design in reverse. This idea that we are using the systems and the mechanics of this designed game to design a game for our opponent in real time, and she is doing the same thing for us. Games like fighting games where this happens in real time with simultaneous choices, they amplify this quality, making it happen over and over again many times a second. And moreover, what makes simultaneous decisions especially interesting is that it turns the problem of solving a game into a higher level problem, which I like to think of as Donkeyspace. So let me explain Donkeyspace really quickly. Imagine a fighting game where there actually is a solution, right? We actually know the solution, you know what to do, and it's a mixed strategy in the sense of, at any given time, whatever specific situation you're in, you should choose between various options with some kind of weighted randomness, right? You should do X 20% of the time, and you do Y 40% of the time, and so on. And let's say that when two players compete, if they both play perfectly, according to this known perfect strategy, then each will have some percentage chance of victory based on the characters that they've chosen. But wait, you know the perfect strategy because you are a godlike genius. But what about this chump that you're playing? You're not convinced that she knows the perfect strategy. Maybe she doesn't know the perfect strategy. And if not, then you should be playing in a way to take advantage of her mistakes, right? You should not be playing perfectly. You should deviate from quote-unquote perfect strategy in order to increase your chances of winning, right? You shouldn't just take the chances of winning that perfect strategy gives you if your opponent is not playing a perfect strategy, and therefore you can maneuver around and take advantage of them. But by doing so, you yourself are no longer playing quote-unquote perfectly. And guess what? Your opponent is doing the same thing to you, right? She's looking at you and trying to figure out how your play deviates from perfect, and she's changing her strategy to take advantage of you. So it's almost like the two of you are circling around each other and around this kind of like point of perfect play, and like two fighter planes in a dogfight having a duel in possibility space, right? And this is what we mean when we say someone is greedy, right? This is what greedy play is about, and this is what punishing greedy play is about. It's extrapolating from your opponent's actions what kind of donkey they are, right? It's reading the signal of what your opponent is doing and not just thinking what's the perfect response, but changing your strategy in order to take advantage of the mistakes that they're making while they're doing the same thing to you. John von Neumann invented game theory in the 20th century by studying poker. Like, what new madness could we plunge the world into if some genius of equal stature studied the turbulent psychogeometry of fighting games and invented a new science based on that? And speaking of science, and another amazing thing about fighting games is that in addition to all of this cognitive and metacognitive problem solving that's going on, there's also this metagame of this ongoing culture of collaborative problem solving on the level of research, right? People deconstructing the game engine, people developing new tech, people analyzing and evolving the overall knowledge about the game and defining and redefining tiers. And this is a search for truth that is like a toy version of science. It's like a real version of science in a toy world. That's beautiful for its own sake, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, coming up with crazy theories, hypotheses, doing experiments, sharing your work, building on the work of others, going off on a limb and having a crazy theory, paradigm shifts. All the stuff that happens in science happens in fighting games as a form of entertainment, as a form of pleasure, and as a form of beauty. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about play and experience. I'm going to, what is it actually like to play these games, right? And to begin with, I want to talk briefly about the paradox of competition. Because fighting games demonstrate how games in general are able to transmute violence and conflict into something else. And they do so because in an intense competitive game, competition is also a form of cooperation. You and your opponent are weaving together a thing that neither one of you could do individually. And together you're creating something beautiful. There's an amazing quote from Bill Russell, the basketball player. And I just want to read this really quick because I think it's a beautiful example of this, of the paradox of competition. He says, every so often, a Celtic game would heat up so that it became more than a physical or even mental game and would be magical. To me, the key was that both teams had to be playing at their peaks, and they had to be competitive. The Celtics could not do it alone. That mystical feeling usually came with better teams in the league that were challenging us for the championship. It usually began when 3 or 4 of the guys on the floor would heat up. They would be the catalysts. They were almost always the stars of the league. If we were playing the Lakers, for example, it would be West and Baylor, and Kuzi or Sam would be enough. The feeling would spread to the other guys, and we'd all just levitate. And then the game would just take off. There'd be a natural ebb and flow that reminded you of how rhythmic and musical basketball is supposed to be. I'd find myself thinking, this is it. I want this to keep going. And I'd actually be rooting for the other team. When their players made spectacular moves, I wanted their shots to go in the bucket. That's how pumped up I'd be. I'd be out there talking to the other Celtics, encouraging them, pushing myself harder, but at the same time, part of me would be pulling for the other players too. At that special level, all sorts of odd things happened. The game would be in a white heat of competition, and yet somehow I wouldn't feel competitive, which is a miracle in itself. I'd be putting out the maximum effort, straining, coughing up parts of my lungs as we ran, and yet I never felt pain. The game would move so quickly that every fake, cut, and pass would be surprising, and yet nothing would surprise me. Even before the other team brought the ball in bounds, I could feel it so keenly I'd want to shout to my teammates, "It's coming here." And I always felt then that I not only knew all the Celtics by heart, but all the opposing players, and they knew me. There have been many times in my career when I felt moved or joyful, but those were the moments when I had chills pulsing up and down my spine. And in addition to that which exists in all competitive games, I think, in all high-level competitive games, in fighting games, there's an even deeper sense of cooperation, which is yomi, right? Fighting games require a kind of deep empathy. There's a strange intimacy in this process where we're exerting all of our efforts to impose ourselves, to dominate someone else. In order to do that, we need to put ourselves in their shoes, see the world through their eyes, in a sense, become them, and identify with them in a very deep way. I want to talk just a minute about how fighting games affect our perception in a deep way. This is Josh Waitzkin, who wrote a book called The Art of Learning. He was a chess prodigy and a chess master who was the subject of searching for Bobby Fischer, and then he kind of burned out on chess and he started to do Tai Chi as just a kind of way to relax and get in touch with himself. And then he discovered push hands, which is the competitive form of Tai Chi, and then he went on to become like a world champion in competitive push hands. And at one point, when he's in a championship, he's fighting against a much bigger guy in push hands, and the following thing happens. So this is Josh Waitzkin talking. He says, "He attacked, and I slipped aside. I sensed I had him off balance, but then his shoulder ripped into me, and I heard a crack. My hand felt icy hot. I knew it was broken. The pain jolted me into a deeper focus. Time slowed to a near stop. I didn't show him the injury, and I quietly fought with one arm, fell into rhythm with his attacks. On the video, his hands looked like bullets, but in the match, they felt like clouds, gently rolling towards me, easily dodged, neutralized, pulled into overextension, exploited. No thought, just presence, pure flow, like a chess game." So we saw this earlier, right at the beginning, with Muhammad Ali, talking about this idea of the ability to do something too fast to see, the ability to slow down time. Waitzkin goes on to talk about in his book that he starts to develop the ability to do this at will. This ability to slow down his perception of time until he's almost like Neo in the Matrix, and he can see things moving incredibly slow and just like take his time and think about how he wants to respond. Well, we've all seen the Daigo full parry, right? Who can doubt that such a thing must have been accompanied by some kind of moment of superconsciousness, right? That fighting games under the right circumstance can produce this kind of piercing, transcendent moment to see into the frames, not just of the game, not just the machinery of the game, but the machinery of the universe, and to see how the universe works and understand it and react to it with a kind of superhuman ability. Fighting games are mind-altering machines. And I finally want to talk about a little bit about the paradoxes of mastery, which I think there are several. First of all, the paradox of the ego. In order to, we're drawn to these games often because of our ego, because we want to win, because we want to dominate other people, we want to express how cool we are and good we are and smart and tough and all these other qualities. But in order to win, you have to lose. You have to want to lose, right? You have to seek out better players and lose over and over again. You have to develop a taste for losing in order to win. You have to break down your ego. And not only that, but you have to study in a way that submits your ego to the discipline of study. There is a beautiful passage here from a sociologist named John Donahue, who's talking about martial arts in general, but I think it goes for training in mastery in fighting games as well. And he says, martial arts training is distinct from the bulk of recreational experiences most Americans are familiar with. Training is a strenuous activity in an age where people are obsessed with leisure time. It is rigidly hierarchical in a society committed to the conceptual state of egalitarianism. It demands technical conformity and submission to the whim of others as a fundamental building block of training. It engages both body and mind in increasingly challenging tasks that engender a type of absorption in the experience referred to as flow. And he goes on to tie this idea back to what we were examining in the history section, right? Because he goes on to say, this individual experience is one that takes on wider significance as well. On another level, the psychic allure of the martial arts is also due to the fact that they are ritual performances which symbolically deal with fundamental questions of human existence: power, the quest for control, the search for identity. These arts then are not only about human physical potential, but about the human struggle to generate a coherent worldview, to invest life with meaning and develop mechanisms for relating to both their fellow human beings and the world that they inhabit. And I think the final paradox of mastery for me is that it's an example of something that is more complicated than it looks, because you look at this game and you think, that's just a game that's, about pushing buttons quickly. I could do that. And then you realize, oh no, this game is deeply complex and can absorb tons of study, and actually to get good at it, it's much more complex. But then I think you go through and you realize there's another level in which the complexity wraps back to simplicity. Because we know something about developing mastery, and it's not about this myth of talent, this myth of pure talent, pure genius. It's about work. Mastery, by and large, is memorization, practice, repetition, drilling the fundamentals, deciding to become good, and then refusing not to. And so this is a kind of a third layer in which something that looks simple is complex, and then is simple again and probably complex at the other end, meeting under the keel. The final paradox is the paradox of style, right? We have this in video games, especially what I think of as a kind of false dichotomy between either optimization or expression, right? Either you're interested in a game as a problem to solve, or you're interested in a game as a way to kind of express yourself. And I think fighting games demonstrate how false that dichotomy is. Because even though mastery is a process of destroying one's ego, of becoming a kind of machine, there's always a remainder. There's always a unique individual human. And it gets amplified and magnified by this process, not destroyed. So there's this famous Seth Killian quote, which I love, where he says, "I can learn more about someone by watching them play 10 seconds of Street Fighter than 10 hours of an RPG." How can this be, right? It can be because our identities are robust, and there's life after death, and because of metacognition and Donkeyspace and everything else, all the complexities under the hood of these amazing games. The final thing I want to talk about is the way in which playing any competitive game at a high level is beautiful in a kind of tragic way, isn't it? It's kind of tragic because becoming the best at anything is sort of a process of giving up on everything else. Right? So there's always something, whether it's tennis or boxing or anything, there's a sense in which mastering anything at the highest possible level and becoming the best in the world has a kind of tragic sacrificial beauty. And yet I want to say that playing a fighting game can be a central part, a central ingredient of a well-rounded life. That playing a fighting game deeply can be a source of profound insight into history, into culture and morality, into design, into ideas and creativity, into the mysteries of the universe and the mysteries of our own minds. And I think that that's what Tom Cannon wants to do with the EVO Scholarship, right? I think he wants to explore these other paths to success and greatness that aren't just about becoming a pro and winning everything and getting a sponsorship, but they're about understanding how mastering a fighting game at a high level can be part of a rich life that is beautiful and meaningful and enjoyable. And we are extremely proud and excited to be a part of that. So that's it. Thank you very much. there are any pressing questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But if anybody has any questions, you can come up and talk to me afterwards. I'd be happy to answer questions about the program. So, all right. Thanks a lot.
Oh, very cool. And so my question is, in future talks, it's wonderful this program NYU has, but what lower division coursework at a community college could